Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. And hello and welcome to anyone who might be tuning in to this short video. This is part 3 of embarking on your spiritual path. So I ended part 2 by starting to talk about how we combat darkness that enters into our lives. As I said in the last video, As I said in the last video, when we get into a lot of these texts that talk about the struggle of the soul and the different stations and states that the soul passes through, these texts often make it sound very easy to pass through these states and stations and posit the annihilation in the attributes of God as an example, as the ultimate goal. A lot of these texts that were written particularly after the time of the minor occultation, so starting in the 9th and 10th centuries, again, they do talk about some of the spiritual tests of the soul, but again, they don't really go into the nitty-gritty of the actual person's life who compiled those texts. We find that the writers of these texts say that they had visions, this knowledge came to them through some kind of ilham, through some kind of inspiration. This is what they saw, and wherever they looked, they saw the face of Allah, they saw the face of God, and so on and so forth. But like I said, they don't give a breakdown of the seeker's or the sheikh's daily life. How did he feel when he woke up in the morning? How did he deal with maybe feeling a bit grumpy if he was starting to fast? How did he deal with his neighbor not being cooperative? What did he do when he saw injustice being carried out in his neighborhood or on the road in front of him? How did he deal with the anxieties of the age in which he was living? And these are the very things that we are dealing with today. And in my experience, again, of coming into Islam, and that was inspired by the fact that a society that has been shaped by Islam still maintains some kind of tangible spiritual dynamics or dimension. The society is permeated through with a deeper way of being, I would call it, or even a different way of being from how one is in a secular society. But when one then proceeds to read a lot of these very theoretical texts that sound very deep and very impressive, there seems to be a disconnect between the vision of the person that has compiled that treatise and the actual daily issues of people that I come across all the time. And you can be immersed in these texts, and then when you want to go out and share the content of these texts, what you find is that people are coming to you with just totally different and unrelated issues and very difficult issues. So, and of course, everybody goes through challenges in their lives. These texts talk about the spiritual challenges, and of course, again, they give a kind of a theory on cultivating detachment from this world, so that whatever happens to you, whether it's good or whether it's bad, does not affect your connection to the divine. We can see that the al-Bayt peace be upon them, the family of the Holy Prophet, had, well, they were at this station. I won't say they attained this station, because they were blessed with this station. They were at this station, so that even though they went through battles and trauma and insults and being attacked and so on, they still maintained that kind of equanimity, that interior balance with regard to the world and with regard to themselves and with regard to the divine. And as I have seen it, when one reads these texts of these spiritual masters, it doesn't really, like I said, go into much about their kind of daily struggles. We more often hear some kind of hagiographical introduction to their lives, you know, about how they were born accompanied by miracles, and how they had some kind of miraculous life, and certain miraculous things happened to them because they were so pious, and then they became known as some famous arif or some famous sheikh and so on. What we don't read about in their lives is what happens when they lose, or what happens when they stumble, or what happens when they make a mistake, or what happens when they hurt somebody. What happens when they might have accidentally said something insulting to someone, or they, you know, the moments when they did not manage to maintain their sabr. What happened to them in those moments? So what I find when I look at the examples of what happened to the Holy Prophet and his family, in fact, when one considers the narrative of the Holy Prophet and his family and what happened to them, of course, as we say every year in the month of Muharram, there's so much to be learned from that. But I also find that what happened to them and the lessons that can be gained from that is a different kind of spirituality from what one finds in these Neoplatonically influenced texts compiled by mystics. And again, like I say, a lot of those texts started to be compiled after the time of the minor occultation. So there was a particular, movement that was starting after this time, and I haven't got to the roots of why it started then. Coincidentally, that's also the time when the Fatimids emerged. They emerged during the time of the minor occultation. So we have a kind of proliferation of these new spiritual movements. What we find in the narratives of what happened to the al-Bayt, peace be upon them, is actually, what I would argue, is a deeper kind of knowledge. And this is the knowledge of the self that arises in the face of what might look like failure. So I remember many years ago I had a friend who, she was Iranian, Shia, and she was troubled by why the Ahlul Bayt, why did this happen to them? Why did all these things happen to the Holy Prophet and his family? Why didn't the Imams succeed in leading the Ummah? Why was it that they were so oppressed? And actually, again, like I say, there's a lesson in this. It reminds me of the verse in the Holy Quran where it says, do not look to the flower of the present life that Allah has given to others, that God has given to others. Do not stretch your eye towards the blessings that Allah has given to someone else, because what remains with the divine of yourself and in the next world is greater than that. And so this verse kind of points out that actually ultimately self-knowledge and knowledge of the divine and a cultivation of the aql, of the intellect, and maybe I'll have a few more videos on the intellect in the future, that knowledge is the most valuable and powerful knowledge. It is the treasure that we can be given, be blessed with in this life. And that, when it appears that we have lost or failed, there is actually something greater than that, beyond that. So I would argue that the knowledge of the self that can be gained from this life is not necessarily gained through striving for this kind of ideal spiritual way of life that we have in our heads when we read these books, and even when we read about these great spiritual masters, that we often hear stories about them, about what an ideal spiritual life they led, and we aspire towards that life, even though we might be living in a very different society from what they were living in, especially living in the West or outside of Muslim countries, or even in Muslim countries. You might be living in a society that does not support that journey, doesn't support that way of life. So again, we need to look at the context in which these spiritual masters were living. Do we live in the same context in which they were living? So we can try, like I said, try to aspire towards this ideal spiritual life, and feel frustrated because we are not living in a society or a world that supports that spiritual journey. So often we feel we can't even commence the journey that we want to commence. We're too busy dealing with superfluous and often ridiculous stuff that we just have to get on with in our daily lives. But actually, within this very challenge is the path to self-knowledge. And especially, like I said, with regard to failing or losing, within that is the path to a self-knowledge that you might not have gained if you had been living in an ideal Muslim environment with the ideal circumstances to help you to embark on this path towards the flight to the divine. Rather, what I see in the example of the Holy Prophet and his family is a self-knowledge, or we could say a knowing, that arises out of calamity, that arises out of attempts by others to smash you or to break you or to destroy you, or to oppress you or to assert their will over you. In that arises a kind of a knowledge that would not arise if you were living a nice kind of, spiritual atmosphere, ideal Islamic life. In fact, the story of the al-Bayt, what happened to them, is a lesson to us of reaching that knowledge in a world that was not ideal. Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam was supposed to have succeeded the Holy Prophet, but because of the way this world is, he didn't. And then finally, when he did, he was assassinated after 4.5 years. So the al-Bayt, peace be upon them, themselves also lived in an environment that was far from Islamically ideal. So it is within this lack of an ideal world that we can then reflect upon that. We can journey within ourselves, and we can start to uncover layers of our own selves that will lead to a different kind of a self-knowledge. So thanks for listening, and inshallah I will load up another video shortly, and I hope this was of some benefit. Assalamu alaikum.